His family laughed at the worthless $10 garage until his retired K-9 uncovered the secret that changed everything forever. Mason Reed had already lost his career, his home, and both parents when the will left him with what everyone called a cruel joke. But the moment his old German shepherd refused to leave that forgotten garage, a hidden truth began pulling them toward a legacy powerful enough to expose betrayal, restore honor, and rewrite everything Mason believed about his father. Comment 1 if you think you'd open the garage no matter what, or 0 if you'd walk away. And tell us where you're watching from. The wind carried the sharp scent of pine through the streets of Hamilton, Montana, pushing dry leaves across the courthouse square as if autumn itself wanted to hurry everyone indoors. The mountains surrounding Bitterroot Valley stood beneath a gray sky, their snow-covered peaks hidden behind low clouds that seemed reluctant to lift. 3 months had passed since Samuel Reed's funeral. 3 months since Margaret Reed had been buried beside him. 3 months since the small farmhouse where laughter had once drifted through open windows had fallen completely silent. Mason Reed climbed the worn wooden steps leading to Dana Walsh's law office without looking up. His faded military field jacket hung loosely across shoulders that had once carried heavy packs through deserts and mountains half a world away. The jacket was clean but old, its elbows worn smooth, its zipper repaired more than once with careful hands. His jeans were faded from sleeping in the driver's seat of an aging pickup truck, and the leather boots on his feet still carried dried Montana mud from the previous night's rain. Shadow padded quietly beside him. The retired German shepherd's muzzle had begun turning silver around the nose. A scar disappeared beneath the fur along his ribs, while another crossed one shoulder where shrapnel had once torn through muscle overseas. His rear legs stiffened slightly with every few steps, but he never complained. He simply adjusted his pace until it matched Mason's. The receptionist looked up. "Mr. Reed?" Mason nodded. "Dana's expecting you." Shadow remained glued to Mason's side as they crossed the hallway lined with framed photographs of Bitterroot Valley through the decades. Old cattle drives, logging crews, county fairs, families smiling beneath mountains that never seemed to change. Dana Walsh stood as they entered. She was a woman in her early 50s whose calm expression rarely betrayed emotion. Her desk was neat except for 3 thick folders stacked carefully beside a brass desk lamp. "Good morning, Mason." He gave a polite nod. "Morning." Shadow settled quietly beside Mason's chair before anyone asked him to. Dana glanced toward the dog. "He's welcome. He wouldn't wait outside anyway. I suspected as much." There were already 2 people seated across the room. Brandon Reed wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Mason's pickup truck. His expensive watch caught the light each time he checked the time, which seemed to happen every few minutes. Lauren Mills sat beside him in an elegant navy dress, scrolling silently through emails on her phone before locking the screen as Mason entered. Neither sibling stood. Neither offered a hug. Neither asked where Mason had slept the night before. Brandon gave a quick glance toward Mason's jacket before letting his eyes drift to Shadow. "Still dragging the dog everywhere?" Mason answered without irritation. "He still drags me most places." Brandon chuckled softly. "Guess everybody needs somebody." Dana cleared her throat before the conversation could continue. "Thank you all for coming." She opened the largest folder. Samuel Reed instructed that both estates be settled together. His wishes were reviewed multiple times before his passing, and every document has been verified. Silence settled over the office. Outside, a freight train sounded somewhere beyond town, its distant horn echoing through the valley. Donna adjusted her glasses. "I'll begin with the primary residence." She looked toward Brandon. "Samuel Reed leaves the family ranch, including the residence, barns, and 36 acres of pasture land, to his eldest son, Brandon Reed. Brandon leaned back. I figured Dad wanted to keep the property together. Dana simply continued reading. The transfer includes all agricultural equipment remaining on site. Brandon nodded once. Makes sense. Dana turned another page. Margaret Reed leaves the remaining checking and savings accounts, personal vehicle, insurance benefits, and family heirlooms to her daughter, Lauren Mills. Lauren quietly folded her hands. Thank you. There was no excitement in her voice. Only relief. Dana hesitated. She reached for the final document. The room somehow felt colder. Mason Reed. He looked up. Samuel leaves to his youngest son one detached garage located on Dead Man Road, Parcel 17-C. Dana paused before continuing. The structure has been assessed by Ravalli County at an appraised value of... She looked down once more. $10. No one spoke. Not immediately. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed unusually loud. Brandon blinked. Wait. Dana remained composed. Yes? That's it? That is what Mr. Reed instructed. Brandon let out a short laugh. Dad left him a $10 garage? Lauren lowered her eyes. Brandon looked toward Mason. Well, he spread his hands. At least now you've got somewhere to park. The smile on his face lasted only a moment. Mason didn't react. Not with anger, not with surprise, only exhaustion. He stared quietly at the worn wood grain on Dana's desk while Brandon continued. I mean, honestly, Mason. Brandon shrugged. You've been living out of that truck for months. He glanced toward Shadow. Now the two of you have a garage. Lauren shifted uncomfortably. Brandon. What? I'm trying to lighten the mood. Nobody laughed. Dana folded her hands. Mr. Reed. She looked directly at Brandon. I would appreciate it if we respected your father's wishes. Brandon leaned back again. I'm respecting them. He gestured toward Mason. I'm just saying Dad had a sense of humor. Mason finally spoke. My father didn't joke about things that mattered. His voice was calm, almost too calm. Brandon rolled his eyes. Whatever you say, Dana continued. There is one additional instruction. Everyone looked toward her. Samuel specifically requested that the garage remain unopened until Mason Reed personally entered it. Brandon frowned. Why? Dana shook her head. He offered no explanation. Lauren finally looked up. Is there anything inside? I don't know. Dana reached into a small envelope resting beneath the will. She removed an old brass key, darkened by years of handling. This belongs to the garage. She stood and walked around the desk. Instead of placing it on the table, she handed it directly to Mason. Her voice became noticeably softer. Your father made one request. Mason waited. He said, Dana glanced briefly toward Shadow, that when you unlock the door, your dog must be with you. The office fell silent again. Even Brandon seemed puzzled. What kind of request is that? Dana looked back toward him. The exact words were... She opened another sheet of paper. Make certain Mason doesn't enter alone. Shadow belongs there too. Mason stared at the key resting in his palm. Its edges were worn smooth. Someone had carried it for years. His father. Without realizing it, Mason closed his fingers tightly around it. For just a second, he could almost remember Samuel's rough hands passing him tools in the barn when he was a boy. Then the memory disappeared. Dana carefully organized the remaining paperwork. There are signatures requiring your attention. The process took another 20 minutes. Legal forms, transfer documents, tax acknowledgments. Brandon signed quickly, already discussing contractors on his phone between pages. Lauren remained quiet, answering messages only after glancing apologetically toward Mason. He signed last. His handwriting looked different now, less steady than it had been years ago. Too many nights without proper sleep. Too many memories that refused to stay buried. When everything was finished, Brandon stood. "I've got meetings in Missoula." He buttoned his jacket. "The realtors already lined up." He looked toward Mason. "If there's anything worth salvaging from your little garage, let me know." Mason didn't answer. Brandon shrugged. "Didn't think so." He walked out. Lauren lingered. She opened her purse. She hesitated. "If you need money." Mason gently shook his head. "I'm all right." She knew he wasn't. They both did. But she also knew he would never accept it. She nodded once. "I'm sorry." "For what?" Her eyes filled for only a moment. "For everything." Then she left. The office grew quiet. Dana remained standing beside the window. "Mason." He looked up. "There's something I probably shouldn't say." He waited. "Your father rewrote this section of the will 4 different times." Mason frowned. "The garage?" "Yes." "He never changed who received it." Dana looked toward the mountains outside. "He only kept changing one sentence." "What sentence?" She smiled sadly. "He'll understand when Shadow finds it." Mason stared at her. "What does that mean?" "I honestly don't know." She paused. But Samuel Reed wasn't a man who wasted words. Mason slipped the brass key into his jacket pocket. Shadow stood before Mason even moved. Together they walked through the quiet hallway and stepped outside into the cold Montana afternoon. The wind had grown stronger. Clouds drifted slowly across the Bitterroot Range. His pickup truck sat alone across the street. Old, rust spreading beneath the doors, one headlight repaired with clear tape. It had become home. Mason reached the driver's door. He opened it. "Come on, buddy." Shadow didn't move. The old shepherd stood perfectly still, his ears tilted forward. His eyes remained fixed across the street, toward the second-floor window of Dana Walsh's office. Mason followed his gaze. The curtains shifted, just slightly, as though someone had stepped back into the shadows the instant Mason looked up. Shadow let out a low, uncertain rumble. Not a growl, not fear, recognition. The same quiet warning Mason had learned to trust years ago in places where one wrong step meant death. For several long seconds, the old war dog never took his eyes off that window. Then the curtain stopped moving, and whoever had been watching was gone. Mason remained standing beside the truck, one hand resting on the driver's door, while the cold wind pushed across the empty street. Shadow never looked away from the second-floor window. "What is it, boy?" Mason asked quietly. The old shepherd gave no bark, no growl, only another low vibration deep in his chest. The same sound Mason remembered hearing years earlier when Shadow had detected danger before any human could. A passing pickup rolled between them and the office building. When it cleared the intersection, the window was empty. The curtain hung perfectly still. Mason studied it for another few seconds before reaching down to scratch behind Shadow's ears. "Come on." This time the dog obeyed. He climbed into the passenger seat slowly, favoring his injured rear leg before curling onto the worn blanket that covered most of the seat. The engine coughed twice before finally starting. The heater blew cold air. The fuel gauge hovered just above empty. Mason pulled away from the curb without looking back. The streets of Hamilton passed quietly outside the windshield. Small brick storefronts, a hardware store decorated with American flags, a bakery preparing for the afternoon rush, and elderly couples walking hand in hand beneath trees beginning to surrender their leaves. Life continued, even when yours had stopped. Shadow rested his chin near the window, watching the town drift by. Mason's hand unconsciously checked the inside pocket of his jacket. The brass key was still there, heavy, warmer now from his body heat. He had nowhere to go except the diner parking lot, where he usually spent the night. The thought settled heavily in his chest. A $10 garage. He almost laughed. Instead, he drove north until the familiar neon sign of Maggie's 24-hour diner appeared beside the highway. The waitress recognized him before he reached the door. "Afternoon, Mason." "Hi, June. You look tired." "I've looked tired for months." June smiled gently. Still true. She brought him coffee before he ordered. Shadow settled beside the booth exactly where he always did, his head resting near Mason's boots. Several regular customers nodded politely. Nobody stared. The town had grown used to the former Navy SEAL and his aging military dog. Some knew pieces of his story. Very few knew the whole thing. Mason wrapped both hands around the warm mug. Steam drifted upward. For the first time all day, he allowed himself to breathe. Outside, snow clouds gathered over the mountains. His eyes drifted toward the parking lot, toward the truck, toward the life that fit inside it. The truck held everything he owned: a toolbox, 2 duffel bags, several blankets, a camping stove, Shadow's food, a folded American flag. Nothing else. June returned carrying eggs, bacon, and toast. "I didn't order." "You never do." She smiled. "You always pay when you can." Mason looked up. "I don't have much left." "You've got enough today." She walked away before he could argue. Shadow lifted his head hopefully. "You heard that." The dog thumped his tail once. Mason broke off half the bacon and placed it into Shadow's bowl beneath the booth. The shepherd accepted it gently. Watching him eat always reminded Mason how disciplined military dogs remained long after retirement. No snapping, no begging, just quiet gratitude. His thoughts drifted backward. 2 years earlier, before the funerals, before the truck became home, back when the farmhouse still smelled like cinnamon bread and fresh coffee, back when Margaret still remembered his name, at least most mornings. The call had come just after midnight. Lauren. Her voice sounded strained. "Mason." Mom fell again. He had been working warehouse security in Missoula. Night shift. Not glamorous, but honest work. A tiny apartment. Enough money to pay bills. Enough peace to start believing civilian life might eventually become normal. What happened? She got confused. Lauren's breathing trembled. "The doctor thinks it's getting worse." "Where's Brandon?" "He says he's flying next weekend." Next weekend. Mason stared through the warehouse windows into the darkness. "What about tonight?" Silence. Then Lauren whispered, "I can't stay." He understood immediately. She had already decided. By sunrise, he had packed everything that fit inside the pickup. The apartment keys lay on the kitchen counter. He never went back. The farmhouse looked smaller than he remembered. Margaret stood on the porch wearing slippers despite the snow. She smiled brightly. "Oh." She clapped softly. "The piano tuner is here?" Mason forced a smile. "It's me, Mom." She tilted her head. "Oh." A pause. "Mason." Then she hugged him tightly. For that one afternoon, she remembered. The next morning, she called him by Samuel's name. By evening, she asked where her little boy had gone. He was 40 years old. She believed he was still 8. Samuel watched quietly from the kitchen table. He never cried, never complained. He simply folded the newspaper and said, "We'll manage." And they did, one day at a time. One meal, one doctor's appointment, one forgotten memory, one frightened night. After another, Shadow adapted faster than anyone. He learned not to rush toward Margaret. He approached slowly, head lowered, tail still, waiting, always waiting. Sometimes she reached for him. Sometimes she didn't. One afternoon, she became convinced strangers were inside the house. She stood trembling in the hallway, gripping a broom. "They're coming." "No one's here, Mom. They're upstairs." "There isn't anyone upstairs." She wouldn't move. Shadow quietly walked between them. He lay down, placed his head across her slippers. Margaret looked down, then slowly began stroking the shepherd's neck. Within minutes, the panic faded. Samuel watched everything. He never said a word. Only later that evening, while repairing a broken cabinet hinge in the garage, he glanced toward Mason. "Good dog." It was the only compliment he offered all week. Months passed. Brandon called regularly, usually on Sunday evenings. Always around 7. "How's Mom?" She wandered into the pasture again. "Damn." A pause. "I'll try getting away next month." "She needs you now, huh?" "I know." Another pause. "Business is complicated." Mason looked through the kitchen window toward Margaret sitting on the porch with Shadow resting beside her. "So is this." The call ended. Nothing changed. Lauren mailed checks every few months. $500, sometimes $1,000. Always with a printed sympathy card. Never handwritten. Mason deposited every dollar. Medication, medical equipment, heating oil, adult care supplies, groceries. The money disappeared almost immediately. Samuel noticed everything, yet said almost nothing. One rainy evening, they repaired a fence together. The silence between father and son stretched nearly an hour before Samuel finally spoke. "You sleeping?" "Some." "Liar." Mason drove another staple into the fence post. Samuel looked toward the mountains. The nightmares. Mason stopped working. "What about them?" "They're getting worse. I'm handling it." Samuel nodded slowly. "I know." That was all. No questions, no advice, just those 2 words. "I know." Mason wanted to ask whether his father believed the newspapers, whether he believed the investigation, whether he believed Mason had failed his teammates. The words never came. Neither man knew how to begin conversations that mattered most. So they kept fixing fences instead. One board at a time, one silence after another. Late that autumn, Margaret stopped recognizing the farmhouse. She wandered through rooms asking whose house they were visiting. Some nights she became frightened of Shadow. Other nights she insisted he sleep beside her chair because she believed wolves lived outside. The safest place became the old barn loft. Mason spread blankets beside stacks of hay. Shadow slept near the ladder. Whenever Margaret woke frightened during the night, Mason hurried across the yard before she could leave the house. 72 hours without real sleep became normal. Coffee replaced meals. Exhaustion became routine. One evening, Samuel found him asleep while sitting upright in the kitchen chair. He draped an old wool blanket across Mason's shoulders. Thinking Mason remained asleep, Samuel quietly whispered toward the dog. "Keep watching him." Shadow opened one eye. Samuel nodded once, almost as if speaking to another soldier. Mason heard every word, but he kept his eyes closed. It was the closest his father had ever come to admitting he trusted someone else with his son's life. Outside, snow began falling across Bitterroot Valley once again. Winter was coming. Neither of them realized how little time remained. That night, Shadow woke suddenly. He stood beside the barn door, then placed one paw gently against Mason's shoulder. Again, then again. A soft whine escaped his throat. Mason slowly opened his eyes, his vision blurred with exhaustion. The digital clock beside the sleeping bag read 3:14 a.m. What is it? Shadow pawed the door again. Mason rubbed both eyes. His body felt impossibly heavy. He had barely slept in 3 days. It's all right, buddy. The shepherd whined once more. Mason reached down and rested his hand against Shadow's neck. Lie down. Shadow remained standing for another long second. Then, reluctantly, he obeyed. Shadow lowered himself onto the old blanket beside Mason's sleeping bag, but he did not relax. His ears remained upright. His eyes stayed fixed on the barn door. Outside, the wind moaned through the cottonwood trees, carrying dry snow across the empty pasture. Mason closed his eyes again. The weight of exhaustion pulled him under almost instantly. It wasn't real sleep. It was collapse. The kind that comes only after the body has spent too many nights choosing responsibility over rest. For a few hours, silence settled over the Reed farm. Then dawn came, not with sunlight, but with a strange stillness. Mason woke before opening his eyes. Years in the Navy had taught him that silence often arrived before danger. He reached automatically toward the place where Shadow usually slept. The blanket was empty. He sat upright. Shadow? No answer. He climbed down the wooden ladder from the loft. The barn stood open. Fresh snow had drifted across the floor. A line of paw prints disappeared into the white morning. Mason's heartbeat quickened. Shadow! The shepherd appeared nearly 200 yards away near the north pasture. He wasn't running. He stood completely still, facing the tree line, waiting. Mason shoved his arms into his jacket and hurried through knee-deep snow. The cold bit through his boots almost immediately. Each breath burned inside his lungs. Halfway across the pasture, Shadow finally looked back. His tail did not wag. He simply turned and walked toward the forest edge, slowly, as if asking Mason to follow. What is it? Shadow continued moving. The broken fence came into view first. One post had snapped beneath the weight of heavy snow during the night. Beyond it, beside a weathered cedar stump, lay a dark figure partially covered by drifting snow. Mason's pace slowed. His stomach tightened before his mind accepted what his eyes already knew. Samuel Reed lay on his back beneath a thin blanket of fresh snow. One gloved hand still gripped a fencing hammer. The other rested against his chest. Shadow lay pressed tightly against Samuel's side. The old shepherd had curled his body around the motionless man, sharing what little warmth remained through the freezing night. His fur was coated with ice crystals. His eyes never left Samuel's face. Mason dropped to his knees. Dad! His voice cracked. He reached for Samuel's wrist. Cold. He pressed trembling fingers against his father's neck. Nothing. No. He tried again. Nothing. Come on. He began chest compressions anyway. Again. 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 Snow soaked through his jeans. His hands slipped against Samuel's heavy winter coat. Breathe. His own breath came faster. Please. Shadow stepped back, but refused to leave. He watched every movement, whining softly. Mason continued until his shoulders shook with exhaustion. Finally, he stopped. The world around him seemed impossibly quiet. Only the wind moved. He lowered his forehead onto Samuel's chest. "I'm sorry." The words disappeared into the frozen air. "I'm so sorry." Behind him, Shadow let out a long, low cry, unlike any sound Mason had heard before. Not a bark, not a howl. Something older. Something broken. The funeral took place beneath a gray Montana sky 4 days later. The small white church overlooked Bitterroot Valley, surrounded by pine-covered hills dusted with fresh snow. Neighbors filled nearly every pew: retired ranchers, volunteer firefighters, teachers who remembered Margaret's music classes, former search and rescue volunteers Mason had never met. People arrived carrying casseroles, flowers, photographs, and quiet stories about Samuel Reed. He pulled my boy out of the river back in '91. He helped rebuild our roof after the wildfire. He fixed our well and never charged us. Mason listened. He realized how little he truly knew about his father. Samuel had spent a lifetime helping people without ever mentioning it at home. Brandon flew in the night before the service. He checked emails during the luncheon afterward. Lauren hugged neighbors she barely recognized. Both cried honestly at the graveside. Neither stayed long afterward. 48 hours later, they were gone. Again. The farmhouse felt larger without them. Colder. Brandon called from the airport. "I've contacted a realtor." Mason stood in the kitchen staring at the empty chair where Samuel used to drink coffee every morning. "So soon?" "The property taxes aren't paying themselves. It's been 2 days." "It's business, Mason." "No." Mason quietly looked toward the barn through the kitchen window. "It isn't." The call ended. Within the week, contractors began visiting. Surveyors walked across frozen fields. Real estate photographers measured sunlight through the windows. Mason packed his belongings without complaint. There wasn't much left. His military duffel, several framed photographs, Margaret's old harmonica, a folded American flag, Shadow's veterinary records. Everything fit into the pickup. The last item Mason carried outside was Shadow's worn canvas dog bed. He placed it carefully on the passenger seat. The old shepherd climbed in without hesitation. The truck became home. Again. Winter settled over Bitterroot Valley with relentless determination. Most nights, Mason parked near Maggie's diner because the lights remained on until dawn, and the owner never asked him to leave. Some mornings he woke before sunrise, already gripping the folding knife beneath his blanket. Other mornings he woke standing outside the truck without remembering climbing out. Combat had followed him home. Helicopter blades existed only in memory. Yet every time a medical evacuation helicopter crossed the valley, his body reacted before his mind. His breathing shortened. His pulse raced. His eyes searched rooftops that weren't there. Shadow always noticed first. The shepherd would quietly rise from his blanket. He never barked. Instead, he pressed his shoulder firmly against Mason's leg, grounding him, reminding him where he actually was. Montana. Not overseas. One snowy afternoon, a diesel logging truck backfired outside the diner. The sharp crack echoed across the parking lot. Mason instinctively dropped behind the truck door before realizing what had happened. Embarrassment flushed across his face. Several people looked over. Nobody laughed. June simply walked outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. She set one on the truck hood. "You came back." Mason slowly stood. "I never really left." She smiled kindly. "No. I guess you didn't." Shadow nudged Mason's hand. His breathing gradually slowed. The world returned. Piece by piece. 2 weeks passed after the funeral. Snow continued falling almost every afternoon. One bitter evening, Mason parked beneath the diner lights earlier than usual. Shadow remained unusually restless. He paced, lay down, stood again, then disappeared into the darkness beyond the parking lot. Shadow. No response. Mason grabbed his flashlight and followed fresh paw prints across the snow behind the building. The beam caught movement beneath an old cottonwood tree. Shadow stood there waiting. Something hung gently from his mouth. He walked back toward Mason, carefully, as though carrying something precious. "What have you got?" Shadow stopped directly in front of him. Mason aimed the flashlight downward. His breath caught. An old leather work glove, dark brown, cracked along the fingers. One small patch sewn across the palm. Mason knew it instantly. He had watched Samuel wear that glove every winter for 20 years. His stomach tightened. No. He knelt beside Shadow. The shepherd gently released it into Mason's hand. Cold leather, weathered stitching, a faint smell of cedar oil. It was unmistakable. Mason's heart began pounding. He had buried Samuel wearing both gloves. He remembered helping the funeral director straighten them across his father's chest before the casket closed. He looked slowly toward the dark hills beyond town, then back toward Shadow. The old shepherd didn't seem frightened, only certain, as if he had found exactly what someone wanted Mason to see. Mason turned the glove over in his hands. The stitching along the palm had been repaired years ago with thick green thread. He remembered sitting at the kitchen table while Margaret sewed it under the yellow glow of an old lamp. Samuel had insisted the glove still had years left in it. There was no doubt. It belonged to his father, but that was impossible. He had watched the funeral director place both gloves into the casket. He had stood beside the grave as the earth covered them forever. "Where did you find this?" Shadow simply watched him. Snowflakes gathered across the shepherd's back. The dog turned his head toward the dark highway leading south. Not toward the cemetery, toward Dead Man Road. Mason looked in the same direction. The brass key rested inside his jacket pocket. Heavy, silent, waiting. The following morning dawned cold and bright. The storm had finally moved east, leaving Bitterroot Valley wrapped in fresh white snow beneath an endless blue sky. Sunlight reflected off frozen fields so brightly that Mason had to lower the visor of his truck. The heater still barely worked. His breath fogged the windshield as he drove south along County Route 14. Shadow sat upright beside him. Unlike every other drive during the past few months, the old dog never settled down. His ears remained forward. Every few minutes, he sniffed the air flowing through the cracked window. "You know where we're going." Shadow's tail tapped the seat once. The road narrowed after leaving town. Mailboxes became fewer. Telephone poles leaned slightly from decades of harsh Montana winters. The mountains grew larger with every mile. Dead Man Road appeared almost without warning. A faded green county sign leaned sideways in the ditch, nearly hidden beneath climbing vines and patches of snow. The asphalt ended. Gravel replaced pavement. Mason shifted into four-wheel drive. The truck climbed slowly between towering pines. Nobody lived here anymore. Old ranch entrances disappeared behind rusted gates. Collapsed fences stretched across frozen meadows where cattle had once grazed. Nature had begun reclaiming everything. After another mile, the trees opened onto a small clearing. There it stood. The garage. It looked even smaller than Mason had imagined. Gray cinder block walls, a rusted roll-up door streaked with decades of rain, broken windows covered by warped plywood. An old floodlight hung above the entrance, its glass cracked and yellow with age. Behind the building, the skeletal remains of an abandoned logging mill rose above the trees. Twisted steel conveyors reached toward the sky like giant broken fingers. The place felt forgotten. Shadow was already scratching at the truck door. Easy. The shepherd jumped down before Mason had fully opened it. Instead of exploring the clearing, Shadow stood perfectly still. His nose lifted into the cold air. Then he began walking slowly toward the garage. Not excited, focused, every step deliberate. Mason followed. The brass key slid easily into the weathered padlock. That surprised him. Someone had kept the lock oiled. The mechanism turned with almost no resistance. The roll-up door groaned loudly as Mason forced it upward. Dust drifted through beams of winter sunlight. The smell hit him first. Old wood, machine oil, cold concrete, faint traces of cedar. It wasn't abandoned. It was preserved. The interior was larger than expected, but almost painfully ordinary. Steel shelves lined one wall. Bundles of weathered survey stakes rested neatly in one corner. Several coils of climbing rope hung beside orange safety helmets. A heavy wooden workbench stretched beneath a narrow window overlooking the forest. Old radios sat covered beneath canvas cloths. Metal filing cabinets stood against the far wall. Nothing looked valuable. Nothing explained why Samuel had insisted Mason come here with Shadow. Mason slowly walked around the room. His fingers brushed across the workbench. The surface was scarred with decades of careful use. Not random damage, purposeful work. Everything had its place. Every nail, every wrench, every measuring tape. Samuel had never been messy. Shadow ignored all of it. He crossed the room without hesitation, straight toward the rear wall. Mason watched quietly. The dog sniffed once, twice, then froze. Every muscle became perfectly still. Mason knew that posture. He had seen it dozens of times overseas. Shadow wasn't searching anymore. He had found something. What is it? The shepherd took one careful step forward. His nose nearly touched the concrete. Then he backed away. Sat. Looked directly at Mason. The exact same silent alert he had been trained to perform after detecting hidden explosives. A chill moved through Mason's spine. No. He shook his head. That can't be. He walked toward the wall anyway. Nothing looked unusual. Only aging concrete blocks painted years earlier in faded gray. He knocked gently. Solid. He moved farther right. Another knock. Solid again. Shadow stood and returned to the first spot. His paw touched the floor once. Then he looked back. Patient. Waiting. Mason tried again. This time the sound changed. Instead of the heavy thud of solid concrete, the wall answered with a faint, hollow echo. He frowned. Again, another hollow sound. His pulse quickened. There shouldn't be. He stepped closer. His hand rested against the cold wall. Without warning, the garage disappeared. Not physically. Mentally. Concrete surrounded him. Gray walls, low ceilings, darkness, the smell of smoke. Breathing became difficult. His vision narrowed. His heartbeat exploded inside his ears. Another memory forced its way forward. A collapsed structure overseas. Dust filling his lungs. Radio static. Someone screaming his name. Then silence. Mason stumbled backward. His breathing turned ragged. Not here. Not now. He reached for the open doorway. His hands trembled violently. The room suddenly felt much too small, too enclosed, too much like the place where everything had gone wrong years earlier. I'm fine. He whispered the lie automatically. I'm fine. But his body refused to believe him. He couldn't pull enough air into his lungs. His hands tingled. The floor seemed to tilt beneath him. He turned toward the exit, only 2 steps away. Then Shadow moved. The shepherd quietly walked between Mason and the doorway, not blocking him aggressively, simply standing there, close enough that Mason had to stop. "Move, buddy." Shadow didn't. Instead, he slowly lowered himself onto the concrete. His breathing became deep, steady, intentional. Mason stared at him. One slow breath, another. The rhythm felt familiar. Deployment. Night operations. The calming exercises military handlers often practiced with their dogs before dangerous entries. Shadow lifted his eyes, never looking away. Mason found himself matching the dog's breathing without realizing it. In, out, again, again. His heartbeat gradually slowed. The walls returned to normal. The garage became a garage once more. Not a battlefield, not a collapsed building, just cold concrete and winter sunlight. Mason knelt beside the shepherd. "You knew." Shadow leaned gently into his shoulder. "You knew I was going there." Mason buried one hand in the thick fur behind Shadow's neck. "Thank you." They remained there quietly for nearly a minute. When Mason finally stood again, he looked more carefully at the rear wall. The hollow section extended only a few feet. Curious, too symmetrical to be accidental. He scanned the surrounding area. Steel cabinets, old shelves, nothing unusual. Then something caught his eye behind a row of tall lockers that had been pushed tightly against the wall years ago. Only a small corner was visible, barely enough to notice. Mason gripped the nearest locker. It groaned loudly as he pulled. Rust scraped against concrete. The second locker moved more easily. Dust exploded into the air. Sunlight reached a section of wall that had remained hidden for decades. Bolted to the concrete at knee height was a weathered bronze plaque no larger than his hand. Its edges had turned green with age. Mason brushed away years of dust. His breath caught. Engraved into the metal was the profile of a German shepherd beneath crossed mountain peaks. The exact same insignia, the same emblem, the same design that had once been stamped onto Shadow's military transport crate before they deployed overseas together. Mason slowly looked in at the old shepherd. Shadow was already staring at the plaque. His ears stood tall. His eyes were fixed on it with unmistakable recognition. As though somewhere deep inside his memory, he had seen it before. Mason knelt beside Shadow, resting one hand gently against the old shepherd's shoulder. "You recognize it?" Shadow didn't bark. He slowly stepped closer to the bronze emblem and touched it with the tip of his nose before looking back at Mason. There was no hesitation in the dog's eyes, only certainty. Mason examined the plaque more carefully. Years of oxidation had dulled its surface, but beneath the grime he could still make out the engraved mountain peaks, the German shepherd profile, and several nearly invisible letters running along the bottom edge. He wiped away more dirt with his sleeve. BVRU. What does that stand for? The initials meant nothing to him. His father had never spoken about any organization, never mentioned mountain rescue, never once hinted that Shadow might have encountered the symbol before. He pressed his fingers around the edges of the plaque. It didn't move. But directly beneath it, hidden almost flush with the concrete, he noticed a narrow brass cylinder no thicker than a pencil. A keyhole. His heartbeat quickened. The brass key Dana Walsh had given him suddenly felt much heavier inside his pocket. He pulled it out slowly. It was older than he had first realized. Its bow had been polished smooth by decades of use. One side carried tiny scratches, not random scratches. 3 shallow lines, almost like someone had deliberately marked it. Shadow backed away a single step. Waiting. Mason slid the key into the hidden lock. It fit perfectly. For a moment, nothing happened. He turned it clockwise. A heavy metallic click echoed somewhere inside the wall. Another followed, then another. Deep, mechanical. Dust drifted from the ceiling. The entire rear section of concrete vibrated almost imperceptibly. Mason instinctively stepped backward. A narrow seam appeared where moments earlier there had been only solid wall. It stretched from floor to ceiling. So there really is something. The seam widened slowly. Not by itself. The wall had unlocked, but it still required force. Mason wedged both hands into the opening and pushed. At first it refused to move. Then, with the groan of steel hinges untouched for years, the massive concrete panel began swinging inward. Cold air spilled from the darkness beyond. Not stale air, cool, dry air carrying the unmistakable scent of pine, cedar, machine oil, and old paper. Shadow entered first. His pace remained slow and respectful. His nails clicked softly against smooth concrete flooring. Mason switched on the flashlight from his jacket. The beam swept across the hidden room. He froze. It wasn't a bunker. It wasn't a vault. It was an operations center. Rows of sturdy wooden shelves lined both walls. Neatly labeled weather journals filled one section. Canvas rescue packs rested beneath them. Orange climbing helmets hung beside coils of mountaineering rope. Steel medical cabinets occupied the far corner. A weather station covered one workbench. Maps. Hundreds of maps. Large topographic charts covered nearly every wall. Each one filled with carefully drawn pencil markings. Colored routes crossed mountain ridges. Red circles marked remote lakes. Blue arrows traced river crossings. Every trail was numbered. Every campsite identified. Every ridge seemed familiar to someone who had spent a lifetime walking these mountains. At the center of the room stood a heavy oak table. Its surface held an enormous relief map of Bitterroot Valley carved entirely from wood. Every canyon, every creek, every mountain pass, every logging road. The craftsmanship was astonishing. Mason slowly turned in place. His flashlight revealed framed photographs covering another wall. Not family portraits. Search and rescue photographs. Children wrapped in blankets. Elderly hikers smiling through tears. Hunters pulled from snowstorms. Flood survivors. Rescue crews standing shoulder to shoulder. Most photographs included dogs. German shepherds. Labradors. Border collies. Every dog wore the same mountain emblem he had found outside. "Who were you?" Mason whispered into the silence. "Dad?" Shadow had wandered toward the far end of the room. He stopped beneath a large black display board mounted on the wall. Mason followed. Rows of engraved brass nameplates covered the board. Above them, carved into dark walnut, were the words, Bitterroot Valley Rescue Unit. Below the title hung dozens of polished dog tags. Each tag carried a dog's name, a handler's name, years of service. Some had tiny black ribbons tied through the chain. Mason read them slowly. Bear, Scout, Molly, Copper, Echo, Titan. Each represented years of partnership, years of trust, years of service. Near the center hung an old black and white photograph. A much younger Samuel Reed stood wearing a heavy canvas rescue jacket beside a magnificent German shepherd. The dog sat proudly at attention, strong, alert, confident. Samuel rested one hand gently on the dog's shoulder. The handwritten caption beneath the frame read, Samuel Reed and Ranger Winter Rescue Team, 1987. Mason stared. His father looked almost unrecognizable. Younger, healthier, smiling. He had rarely smiled in later years. "You never told me." He stepped closer. Beside the photograph hung newspaper clippings. Local volunteers save lost hiker search dog locates missing child after 2 days. Winter storm rescue successful again and again. One name appeared. Samuel Reed. Never once had Mason heard these stories. Never once had his father mentioned them. Shadow continued walking. This time he stopped beneath the final section of the memorial wall. Most of the hooks held brass dog tags. One hook remained empty. Unlike the others, it carried no tag. Only two names carefully engraved beneath it. Mason Reed. Shadow. Mason felt the room fall silent around him. He reached out. His fingers brushed the unfinished wood beneath their names. This. His voice barely existed. This was made for us. Shadow leaned gently against his leg. Not excited, not playful. Comforting. As though he understood the weight of the moment. Mason looked around the hidden room again. Nothing here suggested sudden wealth. No gold. No stacks of cash. No valuables waiting to be sold. Everything spoke of service, preparation, responsibility. His father hadn't hidden treasure. He had hidden purpose. His flashlight settled on a large ledger resting atop the oak table. The leather cover was cracked with age. Samuel's handwriting appeared neatly across the front. Land acquisitions. Mason opened it carefully. Each page contained dates, parcel numbers, survey maps, purchase receipts, dozens of them. Small tracts of land, 5 acres, 12 acres, 8 acres, always purchased quietly, always bordering another parcel. The entries stretched back more than 30 years. His pulse quickened. The final pages contained a complete map assembled from all those individual purchases. One continuous mountain property, hundreds of acres, protected forest, streams, trails, old service roads. His eyes followed a thick red boundary line surrounding the entire tract. Only one narrow entrance crossed into it. Parcel 17C, Dead Man Road, the garage. He read the note Samuel had written beneath the map. Without Parcel 17C, legal access to the preserve cannot be obtained. Mason read the sentence twice, then a third time. His breathing slowed. The county had valued the garage at $10, yet it controlled access to land worth millions. The realization settled over him like another layer of snow. His father had known exactly what he was doing. A sudden crunch echoed outside. Gravel. Vehicle tires. Shadow's head snapped toward the garage entrance. His ears stood rigid. Another sound followed. A car door slamming shut. Then footsteps. Heavy. More than one person. Someone grabbed the outside handle of the garage door. It rattled violently. A man's voice echoed through the workshop. Mason! Brandon! Another voice answered him. Calm, older, confident. Grant Mercer. We know you're in there. Shadow stepped silently in front of the hidden doorway. The low growl building inside his chest filled the underground room. Mason had heard that sound only a handful of times. Never because Shadow was angry. Always because the dog had identified someone he believed could not be trusted. Another hard pull rattled the garage door. Mason! Brandon called again. You in there? Grant Mercer's voice followed, smoother and more controlled. We can see your truck. Mason switched off his flashlight. The hidden room fell into darkness. Only a thin ribbon of daylight slipped through the opening from the workshop outside. He rested one hand on Shadow's neck. Quiet. The growl stopped immediately. The old shepherd remained perfectly still. Mason listened. Boots crossed the concrete floor above them. Someone tested the workbench drawers. Metal scraped across metal. They've been in here, Brandon said. What makes you think that? Grant asked. The padlock was rusted shut yesterday. It wasn't rusted. It looked rusted. Grant chuckled softly. Appearances matter. Mason frowned. That sentence lingered in his mind. Appearances matter, almost as though Grant had expected the garage to look abandoned. He quietly eased the hidden door nearly closed, leaving only the narrowest crack to watch through. Shadow never moved from his position. The contractor entered Mason's view first. Grant Mercer looked nothing like a rancher. His expensive wool coat contrasted sharply with polished leather boots that had never spent much time in mud. Gray hair framed a face that smiled without warmth. He walked slowly through the garage, studying everything with practiced patience. Brandon followed. "What exactly are we looking for?" Grant ran his fingertips across the workbench. "I don't know yet." "You drove 2 hours because you don't know?" Grant smiled. "I drove because your father was a careful man." He examined the shelves. The survey stakes, the climbing ropes, the radios. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Interesting." Brandon folded his arms. "I still don't understand why Dad kept this place." Grant didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the rear wall. Shadow's muscles tightened beneath Mason's hand. The contractor stopped less than 6 feet from the hidden entrance. He stared directly at the section of concrete concealing the underground room. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then he knocked twice. Solid. He moved another step, knocked again. Solid. Another step. This time the sound changed. A faint, hollow echo answered. Grant's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "There." Brandon looked confused. "What?" "The wall. What about it?" Grant smiled again. "Nothing." But Mason saw it. Grant had heard exactly what Shadow heard. He knew. Not everything, but enough. Brandon leaned against the workbench. "You think Mason found something?" Grant picked up one of Samuel's old measuring tapes. He came here the same day he inherited it. So? So people rarely return twice unless the first visit gives them a reason. Brandon laughed. "You've met my brother, I have. He isn't exactly Indiana Jones. No." Grant carefully returned the measuring tape to its exact place. "He's a Navy SEAL." The words hung in the air. "He notices details." Brandon shrugged. "He notices problems." Grant looked around once more. "So did your father." Silence settled over the garage. Finally, Brandon spoke again. "The realtor wants to close next month." "I know. The buyers want the ranch and everything around it." Grant nodded slowly. "I know. They're paying enough already. They're paying for what they know exists." Brandon frowned. "What does that mean?" Grant looked toward the mountains visible through the dirty garage window. "Nothing." But Mason recognized another lie. Grant already knew something about Samuel's land. Maybe not everything. Enough to keep coming back. Enough to search personally. Enough to pretend he wasn't searching. Shadow suddenly shifted. Not toward Grant. Toward the open garage door. Another vehicle approached outside. A small SUV rolled into the clearing. Lauren stepped out. She looked surprised to find both men already there. "What are you doing?" Brandon sighed dramatically. "Inspecting." She glanced around. "Without Mason?" "We're family." Grant politely introduced himself. "Grant Mercer." Lauren shook his hand briefly. "I've heard your name. I hope only good things." She offered no answer. Instead, she looked around the garage. "It's strange." "What is?" "I don't remember Dad spending much time here." Brandon laughed. "Apparently he collected junk." Grant watched Lauren carefully. "Did your father ever mention buying additional land?" "No." Any investments? No. Partnerships? She shook her head again. He barely talked about money. Grant nodded thoughtfully. Interesting. Lauren frowned. Why? Oh, professional curiosity. His smile returned. I develop properties. I'm aware. She looked toward Brandon. You've already signed something. Brandon stiffened. What? The preliminary development agreement. He looked annoyed. Who told you? I read contracts for a living, remember? Lauren crossed her arms. You emailed it to me by mistake. Grant remained silent. Brandon sighed. It's preliminary. It includes Dad's ranch. It includes several neighboring parcels. Lauren looked around the garage once more. Not this one. No. She turned toward Brandon. Why not? Grant answered before he could. That parcel wasn't available. Mason felt every muscle tighten. Grant knew, at least part of the truth. Lauren studied the contractor carefully. Why does one abandoned garage matter? Grant smiled. Sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes access matters more than acreage. Her expression changed. You've been here before. Grant looked almost amused. I've driven these roads many times. No. Lauren shook her head slowly. I mean this garage. For the first time all afternoon, Grant hesitated. Only a fraction of a second. Long enough for Mason to notice. Long enough for Lauren to notice, too. Brandon interrupted. This is ridiculous. He looked toward the workbench. If Mason found anything valuable legally, it belongs to all of us. Grant quietly corrected him. Not necessarily. Brandon stared. The garage transferred independently. So whatever was lawfully included within that transfer depends entirely upon the estate documents. Brandon frowned. You're saying... I'm saying you should read the paperwork carefully. Mason watched the exchange through the narrow opening. Something wasn't right. Grant wasn't helping Brandon. He was guiding him, keeping him interested, keeping him suspicious, like a man carefully moving another person's chess pieces. After another few minutes, Grant glanced at his watch. We should leave. Brandon looked surprised. Already? If there's something here. Grant smiled toward the rear wall one last time. It won't disappear today. The two men walked outside. Lauren remained alone inside the garage. She stood quietly for almost a minute. Then she spoke into the empty room. Mason. He froze. I know you're here. Silence. I won't tell Brandon. Another pause. I just wanted you to know. Her voice grew softer. He signed the preliminary agreement 3 weeks before Dad died. Mason's eyes widened. He already promised Mercer development rights. Shadow looked toward Mason. Lauren continued. I don't think Brandon understands what Mercer really wants. She glanced toward the rear wall without seeing the hidden entrance. But Mercer does. She slipped a folded piece of paper beneath the toolbox on the workbench. If you find this, she swallowed hard. Be careful. Then she walked out. A minute later, both vehicles disappeared down Dead Man Road. The garage fell silent again. Mason slowly opened the hidden door. Shadow immediately trotted toward the workbench. Mason retrieved the folded paper Lauren had hidden. It wasn't a letter. It was a copy of the preliminary agreement. One paragraph had been highlighted. Development cannot proceed unless all access corridors to the northern mountain tract are secured. The listed parcel numbers stopped one short. Parcel 17-C. The garage. Mason looked back toward the hidden room, toward Samuel's maps, toward the carved names on the memorial wall. His father hadn't protected an old building. He had protected the only doorway to something far bigger. Outside, the afternoon faded into evening. By the time darkness settled over Dead Man Road, Mason had carefully closed the hidden chamber, locked the garage, and parked his truck beside the building. He wasn't leaving. Not tonight. Shadow curled near the passenger seat, but never fully relaxed. Near midnight, Mason finally drifted into a shallow sleep. A cold breeze slipped through the cracked truck window. Then Shadow's head shot up. The shepherd inhaled sharply. His ears locked toward the garage. A second later, he slammed both front paws against the dashboard. Mason's eyes flew open. "What is it?" Shadow barked once. "Urgent. Different." Mason opened the truck door. The bitter smell reached him before he saw anything. Gasoline. Fresh. Strong. He spun toward the garage. A dark liquid was creeping beneath the roll-up door, spreading slowly across the frozen concrete. Someone had poured fuel inside. The sharp smell of gasoline hit Mason almost instantly. Every trace of sleep vanished. Shadow. The old German shepherd was already moving. Instead of charging toward the garage, Shadow circled wide through the darkness, nose low to the frozen ground, searching for whoever had been there moments before. Mason sprinted toward the roll-up door. His fingers found the padlock. Unlocked. He didn't remember leaving it that way. The realization lasted only a heartbeat. Then came the sound. A glass bottle shattered somewhere inside. An instant later, orange light exploded behind the dirty windows. The garage came alive with fire. Flames raced across the gasoline-soaked concrete floor with terrifying speed, climbing shelves and workbenches in hungry waves. The heat struck Mason's face before he had fully raised the door. No. He shoved the heavy door upward with both hands. Smoke poured out like a living thing. Black, thick, violent. Inside, burning fuel crawled across the floor toward the rear of the workshop, toward the hidden wall, toward everything Samuel had spent a lifetime protecting. Mason grabbed the old fire extinguisher hanging beside the entrance. He squeezed the handle. Nothing. Only a weak hiss escaped. Empty. He threw it aside. There was no time, no backup, no fire engine close enough, only him and Shadow. He pulled his jacket over his mouth and rushed inside. The smoke swallowed him almost immediately. Visibility shrank to only a few feet. Burning boards cracked overhead. Heat rolled across the ceiling. He reached the hidden wall by memory alone. The brass key shook in his hand. "Hurry!" The lock clicked. The concealed doorway swung open. Cool air rushed out from the underground room. For one brief second, Mason felt relief. The fire hadn't reached it. Not yet. He stumbled down the short stairwell and grabbed the first things he saw. Samuel's leather land ledger. The rescue journals. The carved relief map was far too large. The weather logs. He stacked everything into an old canvas rescue pack hanging beside the entrance. His breathing became heavier. Smoke drifted downward now. The underground room was no longer safe. A loud crash echoed above. Something massive collapsed in the workshop. The vibration shook dust from the ceiling. Mason froze. His chest tightened. His pulse accelerated. Suddenly, he wasn't inside Samuel's garage anymore. His mind pulled him backward. Concrete. Darkness. Radio static. A collapsed warehouse overseas. Men shouting. Someone trapped beneath twisted steel. The smell of burning fuel. Exactly the same. His flashlight disappeared. The room tilted. He couldn't breathe. Not because of the smoke. Because memory had become stronger than reality. His hands stopped working. The rescue pack slipped from his fingers. His heartbeat thundered inside his ears. He heard voices that didn't exist. Move! Extractions compromised. Incoming! He stared blindly toward the ceiling, unable to move, unable to think. The panic closed around him like a steel trap. Then something grabbed his sleeve, hard. A powerful tug nearly pulled him off balance. Shadow. The old shepherd had forced his way through the smoke and into the hidden room. His teeth remained locked gently around Mason's jacket. Not biting, pulling, commanding. Move! Mason barely reacted. Another violent crack echoed overhead. The ceiling groaned. Shadow pulled harder. Still, Mason hesitated. The shepherd released the sleeve, then shoved his entire body against Mason's legs. Again. Finally, Mason blinked. Reality returned in broken pieces. Smoke, fire, garage. Not overseas. Not 20 years ago. Now. Shadow. The dog barked once. Sharp. Urgent. The ceiling above the hidden entrance collapsed. A massive timber beam crashed downward exactly where Mason had been standing seconds earlier. Shadow lunged. He slammed into Mason's knees with all the strength left in his aging body. Both of them tumbled down the short stairway. The beam struck the concrete behind them with an explosion of sparks. A jagged piece of burning wood struck Shadow across his already injured rear leg. The shepherd cried out. Only once. Then immediately struggled back to his feet. You're hurt. Shadow ignored him. He nudged the rescue pack lying on the floor. Even now, the dog was reminding Mason what mattered. Together they hauled the heavy pack up the stairs. Smoke poured into the underground room faster every second. Mason glanced back one final time. The memorial wall. Samuel's photograph beside Ranger. The empty hook carved with his own name. He whispered quietly, I'm coming back. Then he pulled the hidden door shut behind them. The workshop had become an inferno. The fire climbed the walls in roaring sheets of orange. Glass exploded from the windows. The old roof groaned under unbearable heat. Mason staggered toward the entrance, carrying the rescue pack over one shoulder. Shadow limped beside him. Another explosion shook the building. A fuel can burst somewhere near the workbench. The blast knocked Mason sideways. He hit the floor hard. The rescue pack slid several feet away. For one terrible moment, he couldn't hear anything except a high, ringing tone. Shadow immediately returned. Ignoring the pain in his leg, the old shepherd positioned himself over Mason's body. A burning section of roof crashed exactly where Mason's head had rested moments before. Sparks showered across Shadow's back. The dog never moved. Mason forced himself upright. Let's go! They burst through the doorway together just as flames erupted from every window. Outside, freezing rain had begun to fall. Steam hissed where water met fire. Mason dropped the rescue pack into the bed of his truck. Then he turned. Shadow wasn't beside him. Shadow. The shepherd stood 30 yards away, facing the tree line. His nose locked onto something invisible. Then he ran, or as close to running as his damaged leg allowed, straight toward the abandoned logging yard. Shadow! Mason chased after him. The rain turned the ground into slick mud beneath patches of melting snow. Beyond the trees, rusted logging machinery stood like forgotten giants beneath the storm. Shadow disappeared between two abandoned loaders. Mason followed. He rounded a stack of decaying timber. A man in dark clothing stumbled into view. He carried a red gasoline container in one hand, a lighter in the other. The masked stranger froze. For 1 second, both men simply stared at each other. Then the stranger ran. Shadow lunged, despite his injured leg. His jaws clamped onto the man's heavy jacket sleeve. The attacker swung wildly with the fuel container. It struck Shadow across the shoulder. The shepherd lost his grip, but stayed between the man and Mason. Mason closed the distance. Years of military training returned instantly. He sidestepped the attack, caught the man's wrist, twisted. The lighter flew into the mud. The gasoline container rolled away. The masked man struggled desperately before slipping on wet gravel. He crashed against an abandoned loader. Mason pinned him there. "Who sent you?" The man said nothing. Mason tightened his grip. "The garage wasn't enough?" Silence. Then the attacker laughed bitterly. "You already lost." "What does that mean?" The man spit blood into the mud. "The maps," he coughed heavily, "aren't the important part." Mason's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "The relay station." Another cough. "That's where the real records are." "What records?" The man smiled through broken lips. "Ask Mercer." Mason felt his pulse quicken. "What does Mercer want?" The answer came quietly. "The files." "What files?" "The ones," the man swallowed hard, "about your last mission." Everything stopped. The rain. The wind. Even Mason's breathing. "My mission." The attacker nodded weakly. "He'll burn those too." Before Mason could ask another question, distant sirens echoed somewhere far below in the valley. The man suddenly shoved backward with surprising force. He slipped free and disappeared into the darkness between abandoned machines before Mason could catch him again. Mason turned immediately. Shadow. The shepherd stood only a few yards away, swaying. His breathing sounded rough, much too rough. Smoke still drifted from his fur. He took one slow step toward Mason, then another. His front legs buckled. The old German shepherd collapsed heavily onto the rain-soaked ground. Far below, multiple engine lights appeared on the winding mountain road. They were climbing fast, toward Dead Man Road, toward the burning garage, toward Mason and Shadow. But Mason saw only one thing. Shadow wasn't trying to stand anymore. Mason dropped to his knees in the freezing rain. Shadow. The old German shepherd's chest rose in shallow, uneven breaths. Soot darkened the silver fur around his muzzle, and the burn across his shoulder had singed away patches of hair. His injured rear leg trembled each time he tried to shift his weight. Mason slipped one hand beneath Shadow's neck. "Stay with me." The shepherd opened his eyes. For a moment, they were exactly the same eyes Mason remembered from countless patrols overseas, steady, alert, refusing to surrender. Shadow nudged Mason's wrist with the tip of his nose. "I'm here," Mason whispered. "I'm not leaving you." The distant sirens grew louder. Within minutes, volunteer firefighters and sheriff's deputies reached the burning garage. Flashing lights painted the surrounding pines in alternating waves of red and blue while firefighters stretched hoses toward the flames consuming Samuel's workshop. One deputy hurried toward Mason. "Sir, are you injured?" "My dog." The deputy looked down. "I'll call the nearest veterinary clinic. Now." The urgency in Mason's voice needed no explanation. 25 minutes later, Mason's pickup stopped outside a modest building near Pine Creek. A weathered wooden sign swayed gently above the entrance. Cole Veterinary Clinic. The lights inside were still on despite the late hour. The front door opened before Mason reached it. A woman in dark green scrubs hurried outside carrying a blanket and an emergency stretcher. "You must be Mason." He looked surprised. "How?" The sheriff radioed ahead. "I'm Hannah Cole." She knelt beside Shadow, without hesitation. Her hands moved with practiced confidence. She examined the shepherd's breathing first, then his eyes, then the burned shoulder, finally the damaged rear leg. Throughout the examination, she spoke softly, not to Mason, but to Shadow. "You're a handsome old soldier." Shadow watched her quietly. No growling, no fear, only trust. Hannah smiled. Thank you. Together, they carried him inside. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic, cedar wood, and fresh coffee. Photographs of ranch dogs, horses, and search and rescue teams covered one wall. Mason remained beside the examination table while Hannah connected oxygen tubing near Shadow's muzzle. He inhaled a lot of smoke. She listened carefully to his lungs. The burns aren't deep. His leg? She gently felt along the old injury. The impact aggravated damage that was already there. She looked up. Has he had surgery before? Twice. Military? Mason nodded. Afghanistan. Hannah wasn't surprised. I thought so. She continued examining Shadow. The old fractures never healed perfectly. She paused. He's incredibly tough. He always has been. Shadow lifted one paw slightly. Without thinking, Mason took it. The shepherd relaxed immediately. Hannah noticed. He grounds you. Mason looked up. What? When your breathing changed. She nodded toward his hand resting on Shadow's paw. He reached for you. Mason hadn't realized it. His breathing had indeed become calmer. Hannah adjusted the oxygen flow. I've seen working dogs do that before. Not like him. No. She smiled softly. Not like him. Several quiet minutes passed. Rain tapped steadily against the clinic windows. Finally, Hannah removed her stethoscope. I want him here overnight. Mason nodded. I'll stay. There's a chair. I'll stay. She understood. Just before dawn, another truck pulled into the clinic parking lot. An elderly man climbed out wearing a faded ranger's jacket and carrying a thermos beneath one arm. His gray beard glistened with melting rain. Hannah looked through the window. I wasn't expecting Earl this early. She opened the door. Earl. He removed his hat. I heard about the fire. His eyes immediately found Mason. So, you finally found it. Mason frowned. You know me. I knew your father. The old man stepped inside. Earl Bennett. He offered his hand. Mason shook it cautiously. You knew about the garage. I knew there was something your father wanted protected. You could have told me. Earl slowly shook his head. I promised I wouldn't. When? Almost 15 years ago. Mason stared. 15? He made me swear. Earl looked toward Shadow sleeping beneath a warm blanket. He said if anyone led you there, you'd always wonder whether you'd found it yourself. Silence settled over the room. Finally, Mason asked the question that had haunted him since opening the hidden chamber. What was the Bitterroot Valley Rescue Unit? A gentle smile crossed Earl's face. It wasn't official. What does that mean? It means your father never cared about titles. Earl pulled a chair closer. When storms trapped hunters, he went. When children disappeared, he went. When avalanche warnings scared everyone else away, he still went. And Ranger? The best search dog I've ever worked beside. Earl looked toward Shadow. Until this fellow. Mason listened quietly. For 30 years, Earl continued, your father mapped every canyon, every creek crossing, every abandoned logging road in these mountains. The maps. They saved lives. What about the land? Earl nodded slowly. Samuel figured out something most developers ignored. What? The safest rescue routes crossed private property. So he bought it. A little at a time. Whenever he could afford for another parcel. Mason remembered the ledger, the scattered purchases, the connected corridor. He wasn't building wealth. Earl smiled. He was protecting access. Mason lowered his eyes. He never told me. He wanted to. Earl's expression softened. But after your mission, he thought you'd never come home. The words landed heavily. You knew about that too. I knew enough. Earl folded his weathered hands. Samuel never believed the official report. Mason looked sharply toward him. What? He said the story didn't fit. He spent years asking questions. To who? Anyone who'd listen. Radio operators, former servicemen, volunteer pilots, civilian contractors. He never stopped. Mason felt something shift deep inside him. My father thought I was innocent. He never doubted it. Before Mason could respond, Hannah returned from the treatment room. He's waking up. Both men stood immediately. Shadow slowly lifted his head. The oxygen mask had been removed. His breathing sounded easier. His tail thumped once against the blanket when Mason entered. Relief washed over Mason's face. Easy, buddy. Hannah smiled. He'll recover, but... She hesitated. What? She gently touched Shadow's injured rear leg. If he pushes it much harder, he may lose the ability to use it. The room became quiet. Mason nodded slowly. I understand. He knelt beside the shepherd. No more mountains. No more chasing people. You've done enough. Shadow watched him, calmly, as though listening. Earl cleared his throat. The relay station. Mason looked up. What about it? If the man you caught told the truth... Grant's headed there. The records. Earl nodded. If Samuel hid the rest of the evidence, that's where it'll be. Mason looked back at Shadow. I'm going alone. The shepherd immediately struggled to stand. No. Shadow tried again. His injured leg buckled beneath him. You stay. The dog ignored the command. He limped toward the clinic door. Shadow. Another slow step, then another. Hannah watched silently. He understands. I know. He also disagrees. Mason sighed. I can't risk losing him. Before anyone could stop him, Shadow nudged open the partially latched treatment room gate, crossed the hallway, and climbed awkwardly into the passenger seat of Mason's pickup. He settled onto the familiar blanket, then looked through the windshield. Waiting. Ready. Mason stood outside the truck for a long moment. Rain clouds were beginning to break apart above the Bitterroot Mountains. The first pale sunlight touched the distant peaks. Hannah walked beside him carrying a medical bag. What are you doing? Coming with you. No. Yes, you have a clinic. I also have 4 volunteer technicians who know exactly what to do today. She placed the bag behind the seat. You'll need medical supplies. Earl knows the trails. I know injured dogs. She closed the truck door gently. And someone has to remind stubborn veterans that accepting help isn't surrender. Mason almost smiled. Almost. Before he could answer, Earl pointed toward the mountains. A narrow column of smoke drifted upward from beyond the eastern ridge, far above the valley, exactly where the relay station should have been. Looks like we're already late. An hour later, they reached the old timber bridge spanning the Bitterroot River, or what remained of it. The center section had been blasted apart. Broken beams hung over the rushing water below. Fresh tire tracks stopped abruptly at the collapsed edge. Grant Mercer's black SUV sat abandoned on the opposite bank. No driver. No passengers. Only silence. Someone had destroyed the only road forward. The Bitterroot River roared beneath the broken bridge, swollen by melting snow and days of relentless rain. Jagged timbers pointed into the rushing water like broken ribs, while twisted steel cables swayed slowly in the mountain wind. Grant Mercer's black SUV sat untouched on the opposite side. The driver's door stood open. No footprints returned. No voices echoed through the valley. Only the river. Earl Bennett removed his weathered ranger hat and studied the damage. This wasn't an accident. Mason knelt near the fractured concrete. Fresh blast marks blackened the remaining support beam. "Commercial charges," Earl said quietly. "You've seen this before?" "I spent 30 years clearing old logging roads." He touched the edge of the fractured concrete. Somebody knew exactly where to place them. Hannah looked toward the opposite bank. "So how did they cross?" Earl pointed upstream. "There's an old maintenance trail. Steep, half washed away. But it reaches the relay station." Mason looked down at Shadow. "You don't have to do this." Shadow slowly stood. His injured rear leg trembled, but the old shepherd took one determined step toward the narrow trail, disappearing into the trees. Then another. Mason sighed softly. "I figured." The climb began immediately. The abandoned maintenance path wound upward through dense pine forest, where fallen trees forced them to crawl, climb, and detour around landslides left by years of neglect. Mist drifted between the trunks. Water dripped steadily from moss-covered branches. The higher they climbed, the quieter the world became. Conversation faded. Each person concentrated on breathing, on footing, on the next step. Shadow led the way. Not quickly. Carefully. He paused at every blind turn, lifted his nose into the cold air, then continued only after satisfying himself that the path remained clear. Despite the injury in his rear leg, he never complained, never hesitated. Mason watched him with growing concern. "You should be resting." Shadow ignored him. Hannah smiled faintly. "He's treating this like another mission. He doesn't know how to stop." She glanced sideways. "Neither do you." Mason didn't answer. Because she wasn't wrong. By late morning, the trail narrowed into a steep ledge overlooking Bitterroot Valley. Clouds drifted beneath them now, leaving only scattered glimpses of ranches and rivers far below. The mountains stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Beautiful, silent, lonely. Mason stopped for the water. As he unscrewed the canteen, a military helicopter appeared unexpectedly beyond the western ridge. Its distant rotors echoed through the valley. Instantly, his body reacted. His shoulders stiffened, his breathing shortened. The canteen slipped slightly in his hand. His eyes searched automatically for cover. Not because he wanted to, because they always did. Shadow noticed before anyone else. The shepherd turned around. Instead of continuing up the trail, he limped back toward Mason. He gently touched Mason's hand with his nose, then rested his head briefly against Mason's knee. No command, no bark. Only contact. Grounding. Mason closed his eyes. The helicopter continued across the valley without changing course. Not coming for him. Not looking for him. Just passing through. He inhaled slowly, then exhaled. "I'm all right." Hannah quietly handed him the canteen. "You don't have to pretend with us." He accepted it. "I know." It was the first time he had ever admitted that out loud. The trail entered an abandoned railroad tunnel carved through solid granite decades earlier. Darkness swallowed them almost immediately. Their flashlights created narrow cones of pale light that disappeared into endless black. Water dripped rhythmically from the ceiling. Every sound echoed. Every footstep returned twice. Mason slowed. Confined spaces, stone walls, limited exits. His heartbeat began climbing again. Shadow sensed it. Without being called, he stopped every few yards and looked back. Waiting. Each time Mason reached him, the shepherd continued forward, then stopped again. A silent conversation repeated over and over, "I'm here. Keep moving. You're not alone." By the time daylight appeared at the far end of the tunnel, Mason realized he had crossed nearly half a mile of darkness without once freezing. He looked down at Shadow. "You dragged me through another one." The old shepherd's tail moved once. Just once. Enough. Near midday, they stopped beside a narrow creek fed by snowmelt. The water ran crystal clear over smooth granite stones. Earl filled his canteen before sitting heavily on a fallen log. "There was something Samuel wanted me to tell you." Mason looked over. "He said not until the mountains forced you to slow down." A faint smile crossed Hannah's face. "I think we've reached that point." Earl stared into the rushing creek. "After your mission, he started making phone calls." Mason frowned. "To who? Anyone connected to it? Retired radio operators? Former logistics contractors? Volunteer pilots? Even families?" He drove thousands of miles. Mason looked genuinely surprised. "My father." He refused to believe the official report. What made him doubt it? Earl's eyes remained on the water. He said his son would never abandon a teammate. Silence settled over the creek. "He trusted you." More than he ever managed to say. Mason lowered his eyes. "I spent years believing he thought I failed. He thought the report failed." "Not you." The words lingered longer than either man expected. By late afternoon, the forest grew thinner. Smoke drifted faintly between the trees. Not wildfire. Something smaller. Controlled. Recent. Shadow suddenly stopped. Every muscle tightened. His nose worked rapidly. "What is it?" The shepherd moved off the trail. 20 yards later, he stood beside a dark stain soaking into the pine needles. Blood. Fresh. Not much. But recent. Hannah knelt immediately. No animal tracks. She touched the edge carefully. Human. Nearby lay several burned sheets of paper. Only fragments remained. Mason picked one up. Most of the writing had disappeared beneath soot. One corner survived. Coordinates confirmed. Another fragment carried part of a military form. Classified. A third had melted almost completely. Someone had been destroying documents. Recently. Very recently. Earl looked toward the ridgeline. "They're ahead of us." Shadow suddenly growled. Low. Focused. The old shepherd walked toward a half-buried object protruding from damp leaves beneath a fallen pine. Mason brushed away dirt. His breath caught. A military dog tag. Weathered. Scratched. He turned it over. The engraved name hit him harder than any explosion ever had. Daniel Price. His hands began trembling. "No." Hannah looked over. "You know him?" Mason stared at the tag. "He was on my team. I watched him disappear. The report listed him as killed." He looked toward the relay station, hidden somewhere above the clouds. "If this tag is here..." His voice barely existed. Then someone lied. Before anyone could speak again, a faint metallic sound echoed through the trees. A door closing. Then silence. The relay station stood less than 100 yards ahead, hidden among weather-beaten communication towers and rusting satellite dishes. One broken window reflected the fading afternoon light. Then a voice drifted from inside. Calm, older, unmistakably human. Mason. He froze. No one had called him that overseas. The voice came again, this time using the name only his old unit had ever spoken. Reaper. Mason's blood turned cold. Only one man had called him by that call sign, and according to every official record, that man had died years ago. No one spoke. The wind swept across the abandoned relay station, rattling loose sheets of rusted metal against the skeletal communication tower. High above the valley, clouds drifted slowly across the mountaintop, swallowing the afternoon sun until everything seemed wrapped in cold gray light. Mason's fingers tightened around the weathered dog tag. "Daniel?" His voice barely carried. The reply came from inside the station. "Come in alone, Reaper." Hannah instinctively reached toward Mason's arm. "Don't." Earl quietly scanned the tree line. "We're exposed out here." Shadow stood perfectly still, his ears pointed toward the doorway. Not growling. Listening. Mason met Hannah's eyes. "If that's really Daniel, you don't know who's waiting." "I know." He looked down at Shadow. "Stay." The old shepherd looked back without moving. Mason understood. Shadow had obeyed countless commands throughout his life, but never when he believed Mason was walking into danger alone. Mason sighed. "I figured." Together they crossed the cracked concrete entrance. The relay station had once been part of a Cold War communications network. Dust-covered broken control panels, tangled wires hung from the ceiling. Rainwater dripped steadily through shattered skylights into rusting electrical cabinets. Near the center of the room stood a man with gray beginning to creep into his beard. Thin, weathered, one shoulder noticeably lower than the other. He leaned heavily on a walking stick fashioned from mountain ash. His eyes never left Mason. "You got old." Mason stared in disbelief. "So did you." Neither man moved. Years separated them more completely than the room ever could. Finally, Daniel Price smiled faintly. "I wasn't sure you'd come. I buried you." "I know. I carried your name for 12 years. "I know. You let me." Daniel lowered his eyes. "I didn't have a choice." Silence settled between them. Then Mason crossed the room in 3 quick steps and embraced him. Not as soldiers, as brothers who had believed each other lost. When they finally stepped apart, neither man tried to hide the emotion in his eyes. Hannah and Earl entered quietly. Shadow approached Daniel without hesitation. The old shepherd sniffed his hand once. Daniel smiled. "You remember me." Shadow gently leaned against his leg. "I used to sneak you jerky whenever Mason wasn't looking." The shepherd's tail moved once. Mason almost laughed. "You always cheated." "I did." For one brief moment, the years seemed to disappear. Then Daniel's expression became serious. "We don't have much time." He walked toward an old steel cabinet hidden beneath a camouflage tarp. "I've been expecting Grant." "You know him?" "I know who he works for." Daniel unlocked the cabinet. Inside sat a weathered steel case secured with 2 military latches. "He wants this." Mason recognized military evidence seals across the edges. "What is it?" "The truth." Daniel rested one hand on the case. "The mission." Mason's breathing slowed. Daniel looked directly into his eyes. "You remember the coordinates we received?" Mason nodded. "The village." "It wasn't a village," Daniel replied quietly. "It was a weapons transfer." "What?" "The logistics contractor changed the extraction grid before we landed." Mason felt his stomach tighten. "They redirected us, deliberately. Why? Daniel answered without hesitation. To keep witnesses away from illegal shipments moving through the valley. The convoy was never supposed to be there. Mason's memories returned in fragments. Smoke, gunfire, radio confusion, orders that made no sense. Then Shadow, pinned beneath shattered debris, Daniel bleeding beside him, and the order. Leave them. Continue extraction. Mason looked at Daniel. I refused. You did. They charged me with disobeying. They said I compromised the mission. Daniel slowly nodded. They lied. Before Mason could respond, engines echoed outside. Several vehicles, more than one. Grant Mercer had arrived. Earl looked through the shattered window. 3 trucks, at least 6 men. Daniel closed the steel case. They're here. The front doors burst open. Grant Mercer entered first. Rain dripped from his expensive coat. Behind him stood several hired security men. No uniforms, no badges, only heavy work jackets and determined expressions. Grant smiled pleasantly. I was hoping we'd all meet. Mason stepped between Grant and the steel case. This ends today. Grant looked almost disappointed. It could have ended years ago. He glanced toward Daniel. You should have stayed invisible. Daniel's voice remained calm. You should have stayed honest. Grant sighed. That would have been much less profitable. His eyes shifted toward Mason. You know, I almost admire you. You lost everything. Career, marriage, reputation. And still, you kept digging. I wasn't digging. No. Grant smiled. Your father was. The words landed heavily. You knew Samuel. I knew of him. He became inconvenient. Grant took another step forward. He kept asking questions. He kept buying land. He kept preserving routes my investors wanted. Mason's jaw tightened. You burned his garage. Grant didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence was enough. Daniel lifted the steel case. This goes public. Grant's expression hardened for the first time. No. One of the old relay station's floor panels suddenly cracked beneath everyone's feet. Years of neglect and hidden water damage gave way at once. The rusted steel support collapsed with a deafening roar. Grant lurched sideways. The concrete beneath him disappeared. He caught the edge of a deep maintenance shaft with both hands. His security men scrambled backward. The shaft descended into darkness. Grant's boots struck empty air. Mason! He looked upward in panic. Help me! For one heartbeat, Mason stood frozen. This man had destroyed his life, destroyed Samuel's legacy, burned the garage, nearly killed Shadow. Every reason for hatred hung suspended above that black pit. Daniel quietly whispered, your choice. Mason stepped forward. He dropped to one knee, gripped Grant's wrist. Take my hand. Grant stared at him in disbelief. You'd save me? I'm not becoming you. With Earl's help, Mason pulled Grant back onto solid concrete. The contractor lay breathing heavily, ashamed, confused. Before anyone could move again, flames erupted near the rear generator room. A ruptured fuel line ignited beneath fallen electrical cables. Fire spread rapidly through the dry building. Daniel lifted the steel case. We have to go. As they turned toward the exit, the heavy case slipped from Daniel's injured grip. It slid beneath a collapsing section full of burning debris. No! Daniel lunged. Mason caught him. The roof's going. It's the only copy. Without warning, Shadow broke free. Shadow! The old shepherd ignored every command. He limped directly beneath the falling sparks. Smoke surrounded him. Burning beams crashed nearby. Using his remaining strength, Shadow pushed the steel case clear with his shoulder. The case slid across the floor, but a burning timber crashed behind him, blocking the way out. Shadow! Mason rushed through the flames without hesitation. He shoved the beam aside just enough to reach the dog. Together he dragged Shadow and the steel case toward the exit seconds before another section of roof collapsed where they had been. They burst outside into cold mountain rain. Everyone stumbled away from the entrance as the relay station burned behind them. Hannah immediately dropped beside Shadow. "He needs oxygen." Daniel knelt beside Mason. "The recordings." He pointed toward the steel case. "They're inside." Mason opened the latches with trembling hands. Inside rested folders, photographs, military logs, and several weatherproof evidence drives. Beneath them lay a small digital recorder wrapped carefully in cloth. A handwritten label had been taped across its front. Samuel Reed's unmistakable handwriting. It read, "For my son, when he is finally ready to believe me." The rain continued falling across the mountaintop. Behind them, flames consumed the abandoned relay station, sending columns of black smoke into the gray Montana sky. Firefighters would never reach this place in time. The old building had guarded its secrets for decades. Now it was giving up the last of them. Mason stared at the recorder resting in his hands. It was scratched and weathered, its plastic casing faded by years of storage. But Samuel's handwriting remained unmistakable. His hands trembled, not from the cold, from fear. For years he had imagined what his father might have said if given one more chance. Now that chance rested in his palms. Hannah knelt beside Shadow, fitting a portable oxygen mask gently over the old shepherd's muzzle. "He's stable," she whispered. "He needs rest." Shadow's tired eyes never left Mason. Daniel sat heavily against a fallen pine log, exhaustion finally catching up with him after years of hiding. Earl quietly removed his hat. "I think Samuel meant for you to hear this here." Mason nodded. He pressed the play button. Static crackled softly. Then, his father's voice, older, slower, but unmistakably Samuel Reed. "Mason." The single word stopped him cold. He hadn't heard his father's voice since the funeral. "If you're listening to this, then you found the room." A long pause followed. "And if you found the room, then Shadow brought you there." Mason looked toward the old shepherd. Shadow blinked slowly. Samuel continued, "I've trusted dogs longer than I've trusted maps. They don't lie. They don't pretend. And they never abandon the people they're responsible for." Another pause. "I suppose I should have learned from them sooner." Mason lowered his head. "I wasn't very good at saying important things. I kept believing there would always be another morning. The truth is, there usually isn't." The mountain wind drifted through the pines. No one moved. "I know what you've believed all these years, that I was ashamed of you." Mason closed his eyes. The words struck harder than any accusation ever had. "I saw it every time you looked away. I saw it every time someone mentioned your last mission. You stopped looking me in the eye. You stopped believing you deserved to." Samuel sighed quietly. "I need you to hear me now. I never believed the report. Not for one day." Daniel quietly wiped at his eyes. Samuel continued, "A father knows the difference between failure and sacrifice. You were never the boy who left people behind. You weren't the young man who left people behind. And you certainly weren't the Navy SEAL who left people behind. I knew that because I'd spent your entire life watching you do the opposite." Mason's breathing became uneven. Images surfaced one after another. Helping neighbors repair fences. sleeping beside Margaret's hospital bed, carrying Samuel across icy ground after a fall. Every ordinary act his father had apparently noticed. I watched you come home. I watched you give up your apartment, your job, your future. You never complained. You simply asked what needed to be done. Samuel's voice grew softer. I noticed every night you slept in the barn because your mother became frightened. I noticed every meal you skipped, every bill you quietly paid, every time you believed no one was watching. I was. Tears rolled silently down Mason's face. I just wasn't brave enough to tell you. A long silence filled the recording. Then Samuel laughed quietly. You got that stubbornness from me. Even Mason smiled through the tears. The garage was never payment. The land was never a reward. And the evidence was never revenge. I built all of it because someday you'd need three things: a home, the truth, and a reason to keep living. Hannah looked quietly toward Mason. He remained completely still. You spent too many years believing survival was something to apologize for. It isn't. Courage isn't surviving the battle. Courage is waking up afterward and continuing to protect wounded people when nobody calls you a hero anymore. Samuel's voice weakened slightly. If you're hearing this, then Shadow is probably lying beside you. A faint smile crossed Hannah's face. He'll pretend he's tougher than he is. Don't believe him. Daniel laughed softly through his tears. He always did. Samuel continued. Take care of him. He carried you through one war. You'll have to carry him through this one. Mason reached down and rested his hand gently against Shadow's head. The shepherd leaned into it. The recording neared its end. I couldn't give you back the years. I couldn't erase what happened. But maybe I could give you a place where broken people stop believing they're broken. That's what this valley deserves. That's what you deserve. A final pause. Long. Quiet. I love you, son. I've always been proud of you. The recorder clicked. Silence returned to the mountain. No one spoke for nearly a full minute. Only the wind moved through the pines. Finally, Mason whispered, I needed to hear that. Not because it erased the nightmares, not because it erased the years, but because it erased one lie. The lie he had carried longer than any other, that his father had stopped believing in him. Daniel placed one hand on Mason's shoulder. He never did. Mason nodded. I know. For the first time, he truly did. 2 weeks later, the evidence recovered from the steel case had been reviewed by federal investigators and military legal authorities. Radio logs, mission recordings, original coordinates, witness statements, everything pointed to the same conclusion. The official report had been incomplete. More importantly, it had been wrong. Dana Walsh requested that the Reed family meet one final time. The same office, the same 3 chairs, the same mountain view through the window. Only this time the room felt different. Brandon arrived without a suit jacket. Lauren carried no phone. Neither spoke while Dana organized the documents before her. She looked first at Mason. Your father's charitable trust has been validated. She slid several papers across the desk. The mountain corridor, the rescue property, the garage, and all associated parcels are permanently protected. Brandon quietly read the first page. No private sale? Dana shook her head. No subdivision. No commercial development. No transfer to developers. She looked directly at Brandon. Your father anticipated every legal challenge. The trust is airtight. Grant Mercer had already withdrawn every remaining claim. Without legal access through Parcel 17C, the development project had collapsed. Dana reached into her briefcase. There is one final item. She placed a sealed envelope in the center of the desk. Across the front, in Samuel's familiar handwriting, were only 4 words. For Brandon and Lauren. Neither sibling reached for it immediately. Dana folded her hands. Your father instructed me to give you this only after everything else had been resolved. Lauren slowly picked up the envelope. Brandon looked at it for a long moment. Neither of them spoke. The room remained completely silent. The envelope rested between Brandon and Lauren like something heavier than paper. Dana Walsh folded her hands and quietly leaned back in her chair. This is yours, she said. No one else should read it first. Lauren finally broke the seal. The paper crackled softly as she unfolded the letter. Her eyes moved slowly across the first lines before she handed it to Brandon. He shook his head. Read it. Her voice trembled. It should be heard. Lauren swallowed hard and began. My dear Brandon and Lauren, if this letter has reached you, then everything happened exactly the way I expected. She paused. The room remained still. Brandon, I left you the ranch because you always believed security came from owning something solid. A house mattered to you. Land mattered to you. I hope one day you discover that people matter more. Brandon lowered his eyes. Lauren continued. Lauren, I left you the savings because money always seemed like the way you showed love. I know every check you mailed came from a sincere place, but sometimes a person needs your hands more than your wallet. Tears formed before she reached the next paragraph. Mason received the garage because he was the only one who would unlock a worthless door without asking what was inside. Nobody moved. I loved all 3 of my children equally. But love is not the same as trust. Trust is built by showing up. Mason showed up. The words hung in the room, heavy, unavoidable. Lauren stopped reading. She quietly handed the letter to Brandon. He finished the remaining paragraphs silently. By the time he reached the last page, his shoulders had relaxed in a way Mason had never seen before. Brandon carefully folded the letter exactly along its original creases. I'm withdrawing everything. Dana nodded. The paperwork has already been prepared. I don't mean just the claim. He looked toward Mason. I mean all of it. The lawsuit, the objections, the development agreement. I don't want any part of it. Mason studied his brother for a long moment. You don't have to say anything. I do. Brandon's voice cracked. I spent my whole life thinking success meant collecting things. He laughed bitterly. Dad saw through me before I ever saw myself. He looked around the office where everything had begun months earlier. I wasn't here. When Mom got sick, I wasn't here when Dad needed help. I kept believing there would always be another visit. There wasn't. Nobody interrupted him. I can't change that. He looked directly at Mason. But I can stop pretending it didn't matter. Mason simply nodded. It mattered. Lauren wiped away a tear. I don't expect forgiveness. I wouldn't know where to begin asking for it. Mason answered honestly. You don't have to begin there. She looked up, then where? Just start showing up. For the first time since their parents had died, all 3 siblings sat together without arguing. Not because everything had been repaired, because the pretending had finally ended. Dana quietly gathered the remaining documents. Samuel Reed planned very carefully. Mason smiled faintly. That sounds like him. He wanted justice. Dana looked toward the window overlooking the Bitterroot Valley, but he wanted healing more. 1 year later, spring returned to the valley. Snow still rested on the highest peaks, but wildflowers had begun covering the lower meadows surrounding Dead Man Road. The old garage no longer looked forgotten. Its weathered walls had been repaired using the original timber Samuel had stored for decades. The bronze rescue emblem remained beside the entrance. This time, it had been polished until it reflected the morning sun. Above the restored doorway hung a new wooden sign carved by hand, the Reed Shadow, Veterans and K9 Recovery Ranch. Below it, another smaller plaque carried Samuel's favorite words, "Leave no one behind." The hidden operations room remained exactly where Samuel had built it. The maps still covered the walls. The memorial board still honored every rescue dog that had served before. The final empty hook was no longer empty. 2 polished brass tags now hung together. Mason Reed. Shadow. Every Saturday morning, the garage filled with voices. Some belonged to veterans who had spent years sleeping in cars much like Mason once had. Some belonged to spouses trying to understand PTSD. Some belonged to retired handlers bringing aging working dogs that needed a place to belong after service ended. No one asked how much money anyone had. No one cared. Purpose mattered more than possessions. The mountain trails Samuel had protected became training routes once again. Experienced volunteers taught wilderness navigation. Search and rescue exercises filled the forests. Young handlers learned to trust their dogs. Older veterans learned to trust one another. Dr. Hannah Cole expanded her small veterinary clinic into a rehabilitation center for injured working dogs. The treatment rooms stayed busy. So did the coffee pot. Earl Bennett could usually be found outside sharpening trail tools while telling exaggerated stories that somehow became truer every time he repeated them. Daniel Price stood before new volunteers, wearing the same quiet humility that had carried him through years of silence. After federal investigators completed their review, the official military record had been corrected. Mason's name was cleared. The report now reflected what had actually happened. He had refused an unlawful order. He had chosen to save lives. Recognition came quietly, without ceremony, without speeches. It wasn't what mattered most anymore. Shadow recovered slowly. His injured rear leg never became as strong as it once had. He walked with a noticeable limp. His hearing faded further. His muzzle turned almost completely white. But every morning he still made the same rounds through the ranch, checking cabins, greeting new arrivals, stopping beside anyone sitting alone. Some veterans cried into his fur without saying a word. Shadow never asked questions. He simply stayed, exactly as he always had. One cool autumn evening, Mason climbed the ridge overlooking the valley. The same ridge where Samuel had once surveyed these mountains. Shadow walked beside him, more slowly now, but proudly. Together they reached the overlook as the setting sun painted the pine forests in warm shades of gold and amber. Below them, the ranch had come alive. A veteran laughed while helping a teenage volunteer repair a fence. Children tossed tennis balls for retired service dogs across an open field. Smoke curled gently from the dining hall chimney. The old $10 garage stood at the center of it all, not as a storage building, not as forgotten property, as the doorway to hope. Mason rested one hand gently against Shadow's neck. "You brought me here." Shadow leaned quietly into him. The old shepherd's tired eyes followed the movement below. From somewhere in the valley, a brass rescue bell rang once. Clear, strong. A new search team was preparing to leave. Shadow slowly pushed himself to his feet. His joints protested. His limp remained. Yet he looked toward the sound exactly as he always had. "Ready." Mason smiled. "You don't have to lead anymore." Shadow looked back at him, then toward the trail. Mason understood. He laughed softly. "All right. This time, we walk together." Side by side, the former Navy SEAL and his faithful German shepherd began descending the winding mountain path toward the lights waiting below. The world had once called them broken, but the mountains had simply been waiting for them to come home. If you believe loyalty is worth more than money, type home in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. And if stories about justice, courage, and second chances still mean something to you, we'd be honored if you subscribed and joined us for the next journey.